name is Ann McCarthy. I am president of the Norfolk Society of Arts, and this morning I have the daunting task of introducing to you an individual that so many of you already know, love, and admire. This full house this morning speaks more to his qualifications than any words or thoughts that I could convey to you. We really could open this up to testimonials and take the whole hour, but we're not going to do that. Jeff Harrison earned his BA in English Literature and PhD in the History of Art from the University of Virginia. Following that, he performed fellowships at the Art History Institute at the University of Amsterdam and at the National Gallery of Art. Jeff had a 33-year career at the Chrysler, beginning in 1982. During that time, he was made the museum's research curator and later its curator of European art. From 1993 on, he served as the museum's chief curator, and in 2014, received the honor of being named the Irene Leach Curator of European Art. While at the Chrysler, he organized and created scores of exhibitions, from Rembrandt in the Golden Age to the art of video games. He published numerous books and articles on the museum's permanent collection, as well as 16th century Netherlandish art. His latest publication, American Art in the Chrysler Museum, appeared in 2005. And he was also a vital part of the team leading the recent expansion and reinstallation of the museum. At his retirement in 2015, Jeff was named Chief Curator Emeritus. Mark Lewis, conservator at the Chrysler, worked closely with Jeff during his time here. He describes Jeff as passionate, enthusiastic, and knowledgeable. He also made the insightful comment that some experts exclude you with their knowledge. Jeff includes you with his knowledge. I don't think there's a higher compliment to be paid to a scholar or educator than that. We here at the Chrysler have been the beneficiaries of that. Today, that continues. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Jeff Harrison.
Sweet of you. Oh my goodness, well, wow, we should take this on the road. This is amazing. Thank you, Ann. That was really, really very, very kind of you, and I want to thank the NSA as well for including me in this year's lecture series. I want to begin by apologizing for my voice. I sound a little like Lauren Bacall going through puberty. So all I can say is you're going to hear it for 45 minutes or thereabouts. And I'm going to do my best to hold up. I'm going to talk briskly. I have a lot to talk about. The American Maverick this morning. And hope to keep it to about 50 minutes. I know a lot of you have questions, Walter memories, and I hope that we can answer some of those or talk about some of those observations and answer some of those questions. In any case, good morning to all of you. I'm focusing today on this fellow here. Can everyone hear me? Good, okay. Walter P. Chrysler Jr., here he is, who we all know very well in Norfolk, and particularly here in the museum, or at least we think we do. He was, of course, the son and heir of Walter Chrysler Sr., the founder of the Chrysler Motor Corporation and one of the most influential American industrialists of the first half of the 20th century. Now, Walter Jr., as you will see, had no head for or sustained interest in his father's auto business. He would focus instead on the world of art, and he would use his share of the Chrysler family fortune, such as it was, along with his own stamina and cunning, to become one of the most remarkable and singular American art collectors of the 20th century. So, two formidable men, father and son, one who builds an extraordinary career in the auto business, the father, and the son who built an extraordinary career, a business, if you will, collecting art. All of this is of particular significance to us, of course, since from 1971 until his death 17 years later, in 1988, Mr. Chrysler would donate the bulk of his art collection to us. And in so doing, he transformed the sleepy Norfolk Museum of Arts and Sciences, which we see here around 1968, into one of America's most important mid-sized art museums, the Chrysler Museum of Art. Now, despite his prominence in the history of collecting in 20th century America, Mr. Chrysler has often defied easy characterization, either as a man or as a collector, and in fact, surprisingly little has been written about him. The first real biographical information we get appears in this book. It's Vincent Curcio's 2000 biography of Walter Chrysler Sr. But what Curcio gives us is little more than a 3-page summing up of Jr.'s life and career. It's a brief aside from his main subject, which of course is the father, the auto guy. A far richer and more important publication appears a few years later, Legacy, the first full account of Walter Jr.'s life and his connection to Norfolk, and that was published in 2005 by the former Virginian pilot editor, Peggy Earle. Earle does a phenomenal job pulling together all the Walter documents and factoids and anecdotes and rumors into the first full biography of the man. Yet while the story of Walter's life finally begins to take shape here, the parallel story of his collecting career was still largely uninvestigated, hidden in shadow, and it remains so to this day. Recently, there have been a few scattered attempts to right that wrong. Just last year, the Frick Collection in New York sponsored the publication of a major book on the collecting of Italian Baroque art in America. And in it, Eric Zaffron, who is a former Chrysler curator, wrote a remarkable essay on Mr. Chrysler and his Italian collection. What Zaffron proves is that Mr. Chrysler was one of the first and most foresighted collectors of Italian Baroque art in post-World War II America. Zaffron puts him on the map in that area. But that's only one facet of Mr. Chrysler's multifaceted collecting career, which not only involved Italian painting and sculpture, but French and classic American painting and sculpture, contemporary American art, American and European furniture and glass, and on and on and on. In 2009, I tried to interweave these two parallel strands of the Chrysler story, the man's life and collecting career, into a single unified narrative in an article in Fine Arts Connoisseur magazine in New York. But I only had 5 pages to do it in. So the result was fragmentary at best. It was a mere overview sketched out in the broadest of terms. And that's fundamentally it. This information gap can be blamed in part on the man himself. Walter Chrysler was considered by many a guarded man, remote and inaccessible, with only a few really close friends. He kept almost no personal documents, no letters or diaries, and even fewer papers pertaining to his art collecting. There are no export licenses, no invoices, no bills of sale. Over the 3 decades I worked at the museum, I found only one major piece of paper that documented a recent purchase by him of works of art. And it's a doozy, and I'll show you that in a few minutes. So there's no paper trail to speak of. Chrysler made virtually no real in-depth comments about his personal artistic taste, about the aesthetic predispositions that guided him as he ultimately built an entire museum of art. I think the most memorable thing he said about everything he collected was that it was strong. Mr. Chrysler once said he didn't care in the least how he would be remembered after his death. And he once told a reporter he wouldn't want his obituary written because there were things in his life he didn't want people to know. Now, many of those personal things that he tried to keep secret during his lifetime, in particular his sexual preference, he was gay, he was privately gay, publicly closeted, those things would barely raise an eyebrow today. But in the 1930s, when he was a man about town in New York, these secrets, if revealed, could be scandalous reputation killers. He was, after all, the scion of a wealthy and nationally prominent American family, a rising member of the New York patrician class. In that class, scandal had to be avoided at all cost, and cost him it would, but we'll get to that as well in a few minutes. Now, consider, yeah, that's when I had hair on the top of my head. So, consider my particular act of hubris this morning, my attempt once and for all to pull the veil back on both this elusive man and his mind-boggling collecting methods and legacy. And with that in mind, I have a disclaimer and a confession. Though I came on board here full-time in 1982, and though I eventually worked along Mr. Chrysler and Jean Chrysler, my relationship was formal and professional. It was never personal. Still, I've had more than 30 years of messing about in the Chrysler Museum to think about him and his collection. I've done what research I could to prepare for today, and I'm ready this morning to take a stab at it. Now, if I had to boil it all down to a single descriptor for Mr. Chrysler, one that would sum up his life and collecting career, it would be maverick. Webster's dictionary defines maverick as an independent individual who refuses to conform to his group. So, a loner, an outsider, yes, yet often one whose actions and opinions are ultimately noticed, paid attention to, and influential because of their very uniqueness and foresightedness. Now, the classic maverick I remember as a 10-year-old kid during the first golden age of television was a Wild West gambler and card sharp named Brett Maverick, and he was played by James Garner initially, who turns his outsider status to a town's advantage by teaching it a moral lesson. So, at first glance, a scoundrel who proves to be good and wise in the end. A real-life and far more substantial example of the type would be this fellow here, John McCain, who has consciously built his political career as a maverick, upending and eventually influencing establishment thinking with his own singular paths and choices. So, an independent, non-conforming individual who forges his own path, and despite the slings and arrows of the world's critics and doubters, remains true to his vision, and with luck is in time recognized for the rightness of the path he forges. A person who resists the assumptions and categories of his family, his class, and the culture overall. This is the way I see Walter Chrysler Jr., a maverick first in the world of art as a collector, and ultimately in the way that he defined himself as a man. Now, when Mr. Chrysler arrived in Norfolk in 1971, he was 62 years old. His maverick status was well established on both fronts, and he had long perfected personal foibles that one might call uniquely his own, even maverick. And here he is at the museum around 1970, flanked by the two people who craftily engineered his move to Norfolk, his second wife, Jean Outland Chrysler, and Norfolk's mayor at the time, Roy Martin. Unlike the highbrow, coat-and-tied connoisseurs of his generation of American collectors, and they were the ones who served as patrons and donors and museum board chairs, Mr. Chrysler cut a surprisingly informal, even dowdy figure when he arrived here in 1971. He typically arrived at the museum in the morning, dressed incongruously in striped pants and plaid jacket, and sat with the security officers at the staff entrance, clocking in the employees. And wandering the museum during open hours, engaging visitors in conversation about the art without ever identifying himself, a wad of museum keys jangling in his pocket. Let me go back. How do I do that? Oh dear, now I've done it. Now I've done it. Let's go back. There we go. Who was that masked man? Visitors would ask the guard once Mr. Chrysler left the gallery. He was also a surprisingly hands-on manager. Early on, he was the museum's director. He was known for his explosive temper and his obsessive micromanagement, and both of those traits he inherited from his father, and he personally involved himself in every aspect of the museum's operations. A case in point, Willis Potter, the museum's chief preparator for many years, recalled that Mr. Chrysler, quote, had this habit when we were setting up an exhibition. He'd get a folding chair and sit right down in the middle of the gallery. He'd direct you and watch you work, unquote. When I first talked with the NSA about the topic of my talk today, we both agreed to mention these amusing quirks. They're great fun, and I'll come back to them as the talk goes on, but I think we need to see the man more broadly to put those qualities in context. Mr. Chrysler as Maverick. So let's go all the way back to the beginning, to May of 1909, when Walter Chrysler Jr. was born in a small white frame house in Outland, Ohio. He was one of 4 children born to Walter Chrysler Sr. and his wife Della. His 2 sisters, Thelma and Bernice, were both older than he was, and his younger brother Jack was born 3 years after him in 1912. So, Walter was the Chrysler's 3rd child, but he was their firstborn son. And the Chrysler family portrait here from about 1920, Walter Jr. sits with Jack on his parents' left. The 2 boys are on the parents' left. And below, in the individual photos of the 4 children, Walter Jr. is given pride of place at the extreme left, at the head of the line, as it were, because he is the elder son and the father's namesake. Now, as such, he was presumably yoked with dynastic yearnings and expected to continue in his father's path, to enrich and expand his father's legacy as a businessman, an expectation he simply could not fulfill. As Walter Sr.'s ascended the corporate ladder and achieved ever greater wealth and national prominence, and he was on the cover of Time magazine several times, the family moved with him from Iowa to Pittsburgh to Flint, Michigan, and in 1922 on to New York City, where they lived in a lavish apartment at 280 Park Avenue on the fashionable Upper East Side, and summered on Long Island, where they bought an estate called Kings Point at Great Neck on the equally fashionable North Shore. There was also a house in Palm Beach. And in 1926, the Chryslers officially ascended to the heights of polite society when their names were added to the list of elite families in the New York Social Register. So, the young Chrysler's early years were brimming with prominence and privilege. And at first, he looks to be making all the right socially acceptable moves. He enrolls in the best schools. He starts out in the Browning School in Manhattan, then he goes to the Hotchkiss School in Connecticut, and finally to Dartmouth College in New Hampshire. He gets the cultural training expected of his class from his mother, Della, who introduces him to the world of art and who had become the chief emotional pole star of his life. And he starts collecting early, first rare stamps and toy banks, then quickly gets much more serious and daring, and the docents all know these anecdotes. At the tender age of 14, while he was still a day student at the Browning School, he uses $350 that his parents had given him as a birthday present to buy a small watercolor, a landscape with a female nude by the French Impressionist artist Pierre-Auguste Renoir. Now, an Impressionist nude was a gutsy purchase for anyone in straight-laced 1920s New York. You may think, oh, everybody in New York was a modernist. Not the case. And especially, it was gutsy for a teenager. And when Walter took the watercolor along with him to Hotchkiss a year later, his straight-laced housemaster proclaimed it obscene and destroyed it. I know. So, even as an adolescent, Walter the collector was a clear risk-taker with a strong and even fearless commitment to progressive art forms and unconventional imagery. In short, he was a maverick. He was unafraid of raising eyebrows or Philistine opinions. He pushed this tendency even further in 1926. He was then 17 years old when he bought a pastel depicting a hand by the revolutionary Cubist artist Pablo Picasso. Now, even his parents thought this work was radical, though their disapproval didn't slow him down. So already at 17, he was a burgeoning maverick collector of avant-garde French art, a future trendsetter whose tastes would be perpetually misunderstood by his social register peers. Walter enters Dartmouth in 1929, but he lasted only 2 years. He apparently had no interest in academic pursuits, and in any case, he made low grades in or failed every subject except philosophy. And in his second year, he stopped going to class altogether. He was also plagued by health issues, including a persistent bleeding ulcer. Nonetheless, he continued to build his modernist collection at Dartmouth, which again, school officials viewed as suspect and even pornographic. And when he flunked out and came back to the family in New York in 1931, his loving and some might say overly indulgent mother takes him to Paris. And it was that trip that really launches Walter Chrysler's obsession with the modern school of Paris. It begins an intense decade-long love affair from 1931 to 1941 between him and French modernist art, particularly the Cubists Pablo Picasso and Georges Braque and other vanguard masters. Right through the Depression, Chrysler money keeps him afloat. The Chryslers did well during the Depression. Everybody needs a car. Walter was hardly the only progressive American collector at the time who was interested in the avant-garde. The Museum of Modern Art, which had opened in Manhattan only a few years before, in 1929, was expressly dedicated to the modern, and especially French modern art, and it served to nurture an ever-growing contingent of young American private collectors. Excuse me. Here's the museum in 1932. It was in a rented townhouse on West 53rd Street. It's a tiny place, not the great institution we see today. Walter served as the first chairman of MoMA's library committee, and he even donated a Picasso to it in 1931. Still, he was one of only a tiny handful of Americans who genuinely saw the value in and took a chance on the modernists. And he would do so with a vengeance, leaving all of his collector competitors in the dust, as he set about amassing the largest private holding of French modernist art in America, including major Cubist paintings, drawings, and other works on paper by Picasso, Georges Braque, and equally major works by Henri Matisse and other fauve artists. Let's see if I can get this to work. That's the Picasso he gave to the Museum of Modern Art. And that wonderful blue period Picasso, he convinced Gertrude Stein in Paris to sell it to a third party, and then he quietly bought it from that party. That's Walter. That's Walter. All right. By 1940, it was claimed that Mr. Chrysler owned 347 Picassos alone. That's painting, sculpture, and works on paper, a lot of prints. Now, that number is probably exaggerated, but there is no doubt that the collection was a substantial one by any measure. In the realm of modern art collecting, he was then an obsessive maverick among mavericks. So in the realm of art, beauty, and collecting, he was very much his mother's son. So, how did he fare on the other side of the parental divide? With his father, family finance, and the wider world of business? Not nearly as well. Walter once said that, quote, "Dad was too busy to pay much attention to me." But Walter was hardly a model son. Already at Dartmouth, Walter Jr. started art projects, collecting antiques and founding an arts magazine. He wanted to keep up with another student at the time, Nelson Rockefeller, and those things collapsed in a shower of unpaid bills, which his father had to cover. The worst of these ill-fated ventures was a book publishing company that called Cheshire House, which lost $38,000 on a single volume. In the Depression, his father paid off the creditors. Needless to say, Walter Sr. sensed trouble. And after Jr. left college and came back home from Europe, he set him to work in the Chrysler Building, his new skyscraper headquarters, at the corner of 42nd Street and Lexington Avenue. He demanded that Jr. start at the corporate bottom in the purchasing department and allowed him to rise to chairman of the board of the Chrysler Building by 1936. Now, as important as that title might sound, it was essentially an empty figurehead position, one that Walter Sr. used to keep an eye on him and where he could, quote, do no harm. His work in the Chrysler Air Temp division, that was the first air conditioning system on wheels, putting air conditioning in cars. Walter was in charge of that, but that also ultimately proved a failure. Now, despite all this, despite his eyebrow-raising art collecting, his shortcomings in the realm of business, and his closeted gayness, Walter Jr., in public at least, played the kind of conservative, conventional social role that was expected of him as a young, rising, eligible member of the New York upper crust. And here he is on the town with his sister Thelma. He's first mentioned in the Social Register in 1929. In the early 1930s, he sets himself up in an 11-room Park Avenue apartment, and he establishes himself as a member in good standing, both well-behaved and well-liked, in a raft of elite clubs and other organizations, among them the New York Yacht Club, the New York Athletic Club, the Dartmouth Club, the Madison Square Garden Club, and the exclusive Greek Club on Long Island. He even joins the Sons of the American Revolution. So he cuts a public figure at the very center of, and seemingly comfortable in, the New York business and cultural elite. The final step in this social ascent was to find someone to share all of that with, to marry and to marry well. And the pressure from his family and from 1930's social convention to do that must have been considerable. In any case, on April 29, 1938, in St. Bartholomew's Church, Walter marries a 25-year-old Manhattan socialite named Marguerite Prince Sykes, Peggy Sykes, who is breathlessly described in the press as the most sought-after girl in New York society. They embarked on a European honeymoon that Walter used, of course, to buy art in Paris and to introduce Peggy to Pablo Picasso and Gertrude Stein and the rest of the city's avant-garde. On their return to New York, the couple settles into a 14-room apartment at 2 East 67th Street, that's the building today, and they spend their weekends at Kings Point on Long Island. Yet for all its material advantages, the marriage was doomed from the start. Right after the honeymoon, Walter's beloved mother Della died, and his father suffered a stroke that would plague him until his death 2 years later. So Walter's principal emotional mainstays were suddenly slipping away just as he was trying to establish his own emotional independence. And his new wife gave no sign of becoming his partner and supporter in the world of art. She openly disliked Picasso's paintings, so much so that she even refused to sit for her portrait by him. She later joked that she didn't want 5 noses and 6 eyes. Bless her heart. And when, a few months later, Walter bought this gutsy modernist sculpture in our collection, Gaston Lachaise's Man, and had it installed at the head of the lane at Kings Point, Peggy put her foot down and had it removed. Life with Walter was considerably more difficult. Peggy later described him as a temperamental and brooding mate, a man with a puffed-up superiority complex, prone to sudden fits of temper and completely preoccupied by his art collecting. She was not his passion, art was. And as it turned out, she lasted only a year and a half, until October 1939, when she went to Nevada and got a Reno divorce. Now, the stated reason was, quote, extreme cruelty, unquote, but almost certainly the marriage was never consummated. She later said that all he wanted from her was to keep his feet warm at night. Walter, of course, was gay. He hoped for a marriage of convenience that she would accept in return for the wealth and prestige that came with the Chrysler name. Well, Peggy wanted nothing of it. Now, I should tell you that despite her retrograde artistic tastes, Peggy Sykes would become a feminist pioneer. In 1948, she graduated from the New York University School of Medicine, and that was only the second class there to admit women. and she went on to a distinguished 40-year career in chemotherapy at Memorial Sloan Kettering Hospital in Manhattan. She died in 2012 at the age of 98. So, two very strong-willed individuals at loggerheads equals one doomed marriage. Now, the family did the best it could to hush up the divorce and any residual scandal, so Walter could have conceivably stayed on in New York. People would talk, no doubt, but business could go on as usual. But what's interesting is that soon after he's divorced, he begins a series of withdrawals from the city. He continues to focus his collecting there. He keeps his Manhattan apartment and his art storage warehouse on Charles Street to facilitate all that. But he spends more and more time away, first in Virginia horse country, then in Provincetown, Massachusetts, and eventually with us in Norfolk, step by step, loosening his grasp on Manhattan and the constraints of his life there. Walter's new mobility and freedom may have been prompted by the recent passing of his parents, who were, of course, the two central anchors of his previous life, and also by the sudden financial windfall that their passing brought him. This is the Chrysler family mausoleum in Sleepy Hollow Cemetery in Tarrytown, New York. They're all buried there. Jean is buried there. Where Della was interned, the mother was interred when she died in August 1938. She left a small estate, about $30,000. When Walter Sr. died 2 years later, and here are Walter Jr. and Thelma at his funeral, he bequeathed $9 million to his 4 children. Now, that's roughly $2.25 million per child, the equivalent of about $40 million today. Not a lot of money. I mean, good, but, you know, how do you build a museum on that? Anyway, now, already in the 1920s, Walter Sr. had begun to settle a good deal of money on his children anyway, either in cash, stocks, or trusts. And while $2 million in 1940 hardly matched the assets of a Vanderbilt or a Rockefeller, it was more than enough to finally give Walter Jr. genuine financial independence. And in April 1941, he makes his first major independent real estate purchase. He buys for $175,000 a piece of property not in Manhattan, but in Northern Virginia. He buys a 1,100-acre estate and horse farm called North Wales near Warrenton. Now, the house dated from the 18th century. It was immense. It had 72 rooms, complete with a ballroom, a trophy room, and a hunt room. There were stables and a horse training track. There was a lake, a golf course, and even a private airfield. Chrysler had dabbled before in horse racing, and he ostensibly set himself up in North Wales as a country gentleman intent upon horse breeding and racing. Here he is at his desk in North Wales, working at his desk with a photo, notice this, a photo of his mother Della beside him. Even in death, she remained his emotional rock. And North Wales also became a spectacular showplace for his French modernist collection, an elegant retreat for a newly wealthy young man reinventing himself as a bachelor in the country. There are others who believe that he simply bought the place as a tax shelter to protect his inheritance. And North Wales may have served another purpose. It was only a short commute from there to Washington, D.C., where government jobs could be had. Now remember, in April 1941, World War II was already underway in Europe. It was looming in the U.S. The transatlantic art trade had all but stopped, bringing Walter's collecting juggernaut to a sudden halt. With time now on his hands, and with the newly instituted draft looming for young men like him, unmarried, no children, he may well have hoped to avoid conscription and also to burnish his reputation by landing a prestigious civilian wartime job with the feds in D.C. And in June 1941, let's go back. And in June of 1941, he attempts to do just that when he applies for a position in the Washington Office of Production Management. Now, that office was designed to convert peacetime industries, like America's auto industry, to wartime needs. And Walter may have thought that his Chrysler name and experience, such as it was, would make him an ideal candidate. So, Following standard government procedure for wartime positions, his application led J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI to open a confidential investigation into his, quote, character, reputation, qualifications, loyalty, patriotism, and political affiliations, unquote. The file has recently been made public through the Freedom of Information Act, and I have read it. It includes interviews and testimonials from virtually everyone of consequence in Walter Chrysler's life, from his student days at Hotchkiss and Dartmouth to his current neighbors and staff in Manhattan, Great Neck, and North Wales, his fellow club members in the city, and his business colleagues at Chrysler, and even Peggy Sykes. Everyone stated without hesitation that Mr. Chrysler was a true blue patriot, a 100% American who incidentally probably voted Republican. So, the crucial question of his loyalty to the United States on the eve of World War II was unanimously affirmed. His club colleagues said that he was well-liked and well-behaved in public. They never saw him inebriated, and a few others had positive things to say about his drive and work ethic when a project interested him. But most of the commentators went after him hammer and tongs. And what they said, frankly, reveals as much about the homophobia and Philistinism, of 1940, 1940 America, as it does about Walter Chrysler's alleged behavioral flaws. He's called out for being a spoiled rich man's son with an explosive temper, a loner with no real friends and no business sense, a man who never paid his bills and never tipped the doorman. Fair enough. But more importantly, he's more broadly condemned for his gayness. It had long been an open secret. The interviewees unleashed a volley of crude epithets to describe his orientation, the least caustic of which was moral degenerate. And they went on to dismiss his modernist art collection as bad, lewd, and even pornographic. Reading the file, one begins to understand why, given the cultural mindset of the 30s and 40s, Mr. Chrysler emerged from all that not wanting his obituary written. In any case, J. Edgar Hoover rejected the application and didn't give him the job. Any of you all who know J. Edgar Hoover's background, that is the pot calling the kettle black. Now, time, of course, quickly marches on. Japan attacks Pearl Harbor, the U.S. enters the war, and 4 months later, in April 1942, a 32-year-old Walter Chrysler suddenly gets a Navy commission, entering the service as a lieutenant, junior grade. Almost certainly the family did a deal and got him in. And this is where we in this room start to appear in the story, because Walter's first posting was in Norfolk, where he meets Jean Outland, a young woman from an established local family who taught at William & Mary's Norfolk Division, that's today ODU. They hardly had time to get to know each other when Walter was transferred to Florida, to Key West. Now, if the many images of Walter in his uniform are any indication, he was clearly proud of his appointment. He even commissioned, you can see here, a painted portrait of himself in military gear, standing somewhat oddly in the Virginia countryside with North Wales in the distance. I think it's charming. I think there's even a plane flying over. I love it. Bless his heart, bless his heart. All right. Which makes what happens next all the more puzzling, because in December 1944, he abruptly resigns his commission and leaves the Navy in wartime. Now, much later, rumors would emerge about parties in his rooms off base, possibly gay parties. In any event, the Washington Office of Naval Intelligence began to investigate. They even went to interview him in Florida, but we'll never know for sure what actually forced him to resign, because the Navy's file on the matter simply disappeared. Now, one senses again the Chrysler family and its lawyers coming to the rescue, working behind the scenes to avoid another scandal. And here's another head spinner. Less than a month later, Walter returns to Norfolk and in a quiet ceremony in the Freemason Street Baptist Church, marries Jean Outland. Again, one can only conclude that the family leaned in hard and demanded he give up his errant ways and settle down once and for all. Now, Jean Outland was not a New York debutante like Peggy Sykes, yet she did offer crucial things that Walter desperately needed. She offered loyalty, stability, and what proved to be an enduring commitment to his central passion, art. She became a genuine partner in his lifelong quest to collect. Now, Jean must have known she shouldn't wear high heels either. I mean, yeah. Walter wasn't that tall. Jean must have known it wouldn't be a marriage of convenience. Would be a marriage of convenience. Beyond that, I will not presume to comment on the nature of Walter and Jean's life together. But I will tell you that they worked together tirelessly to establish their collection and ultimately a museum, and that though they were childless, their marriage lasted a full 36 years until Jean's sudden death in Norfolk from an aneurysm in 1982. Walter was shocked and heartbroken. "We were a team, Jean and I," he said at the time. "And I guess the most important thing was that I could be a pal to Jean and she could be a pal to me." Now, that may sound like faint praise, but when you consider how few real confidants Walter may have had in his life, being a real pal was probably everything to him. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's go back to 1945. The war has ended, the international art trade has begun to reopen, and Walter, now with Jean alongside him, gets back to his real life's work, collecting. And his maverick tendencies reemerge with a vengeance. Now, the revival of the European art market brought with it a range of new collecting opportunities. Many of Europe's finest private collections of historic paintings, 19th century paintings, and more importantly, old master paintings, began to break up. Their contents were being sold off to counter the financial stresses of the war. It was a once-in-a-century buying opportunity. Major old family collections in England, France, and Italy, filled with historic masterpieces out of circulation for centuries, were now coming on the block, and Walter Chrysler jumped at it. So instead of buying more French modernist art, more Picasso and company, he radically shifted his focus and time periods and started scooping up 19th century art and old master paintings dating all the way back to the Renaissance. Now, many of these works, and they've all come to us, were famous blue chip masterpieces, works that he likely paid a pretty penny for to own. Works like our, starting at the upper left, our Hossart, our Veronese, our Boucher, our Delacroix, our Gauguin, our Renoir, on and on and on. But the maverick in him also saw the incredible bargains to be had, buying equally masterful works from artistic periods or schools that in the 1950s and 60s were unfashionable and viewed as minor and therefore cheap. As I've already said, as early as 1953, he begins to build a phenomenal collection of Italian Baroque paintings, well before the critics reassessed them and collectors rushed in to buy what was left. This is how we got masterpieces like our Guido Reni here, upper left, our Guercino, our Salvatore Rosa, our Crespi, our Pittoni, our Giordano. Equally maverick was his sudden interest in French academic painting, a form of conservative 19th century European art that critics in the 1950s and 60s literally hated. They said it was empty and false. They loved the modernists, the impressionists instead. And so, with that market at rock bottom, he bought phenomenal works by the great French academic masters for a song. Works like our Gérôme, our Bouguereau, our Glare, our Laurence, our Doré, which sold in a sale in London in 1960. Christie's in London, 1960, and sold for 35 pounds, the Doré. Yeah. Walter probably got it for less than $1,000. And the Lefebvre. Now, as taste changed, that market began to rise in the 1970s, and works like these today cost millions of dollars. Now, Walter not only changed his taste after 1945, he also dramatically ramped up his collecting process. Around 1952, he begins to buy in astonishing numbers and at extraordinary high velocity, tens of thousands of objects in the decades of the 50s and 60s. He once boasted he had owned over 800 European paintings. Now, there are no documents to prove it, but consider this 1956 Look magazine article featuring him, where he's standing in his New York warehouse, filled to bursting with European old master paintings, the Veronese right behind him. The article gets his job right, too. It calls him, right down here, an art tycoon. Yeah. And consider this. The only major piece of paper I've ever uncovered about Mr. Chrysler's post-World War II picture buying. It's an invoice and export document compiled by the Parisian art dealer and agent René Haas. It's dated April 12, 1954, and it is addressed to Monsieur Walter Chrysler Jr., Chrysler Building, New York, New York, USA. Apparently, that's all that was needed. The invoice runs for 4 single-space typewritten pages and lists more than 100 paintings recently acquired by Chrysler in France. So, 100 plus paintings on one invoice alone. All right. Also, while many American private collectors of Walter's generation tended to focus their energies and hone their interests on an ever tighter and more focused concentration of treasures, Walter continued to gather massively and simultaneously on multiple fronts without editing. As early as 1952, he begins to buy hundreds of historic American paintings, when many were still being dismissed as mere antiques or bits of Americana. By 1957, he had already bought major American works like our Child Hassam, our Cassatt, our Ernest Lawson, our Bellows, our Glackens, our Henry, on and on. He also bought masses of furniture, silver, antiquities, and of course, glass, which again was underrated and undervalued when he was buying it in the 1950s. 10,000 plus pieces, which eventually, of course, becomes for us a museum within a museum. It's phenomenal. And all of this happens in 2 decades, from 1950 to 1970. He was still as risk-taking and forward-thinking as he was in the 1930s, though now he was exponentially more active. In short, the Art Maverick goes into hyperdrive. And how does he pay for all this obsessive buying? Well, you remember that Walter never had the money of a Vanderbilt or a Rockefeller. His wealth was largely invested in his art. He was essentially art rich and cash poor. So to keep buying after 1945, and he was obsessed, he basically sold off or traded his pre-war French modernist collection, which had considerably increased in value. He sold all those Picassos but one, all the Braques but one, and all the Matisses but one. Simply put, he swaps one collection for another with World War II as the pivot point. And that second collection, which is the second collection is which comes to us in 1971, was so vast and so diverse and so comprehensive that by the mid-50s it had achieved the scope of a genuinely encyclopedic art museum. So, what prompts him to transform his private collection into a public museum, to open a Chrysler Museum? He wanted his name on it. It seems to have been due largely to family tragedy. In 1957, Walter's sister Thelma, who had led the life of a New York socialite, and she was also an art collector in her own right. She initially owned the Renoir that we have. Walter bought it at her estate sale. She didn't give it to him. He had to buy it. She dies of leukemia in Manhattan, and she was 55 years old. And 1 year later, in 1958, Walter's younger brother Jack died suddenly of a heart attack at the age of 46. Now, Jack, in a sense, was the real family hero. He'd done everything right. He was universally well-liked. He married and had children, and he had a distinguished career in the Navy and in the Chrysler business. And suddenly he was gone. leaving Walter, the family's lone male standard bearer. Both of those events brought thoughts of mortality and family legacy to the fore, and with them, a desire to build some sort of monument to carry the family name. And this is precisely when Walter opens his museum. But not in Manhattan, where you might expect the Chrysler name would carry the most weight. And indeed, not in any major urban area that had shown keen interest in his collection before. Not Philadelphia, say, or Chicago, or Detroit, or even Richmond. Instead, he chooses a small New England coastal village, Provincetown, Massachusetts, and he spends $40,000 to buy the town's defunct Central Methodist Church, which you see here. He rapidly renovates it and opens it in July 1958 as the Chrysler Art Museum. Why, of all places, Provincetown? Well, maybe it was close to New York, he could get back to his apartment and do stuff, but I think there are two fundamental reasons. The culture there was far more bohemian and laid back, and welcoming to alternative and creative folks. The town was a burgeoning gay mecca, and we're on the verge of the 1960s, when social mores were at long last loosening up. But more significantly, it had a thriving vanguard summer artist colony, a place where Walter could engage directly and informally with giants like Hans Hofmann and Franz Klein. And this is Hofmann's studio in Provincetown, his teaching studio. He could live among these people, and he loved that. And this is exactly when he starts buying major contemporary American paintings, abstract expressionist and pop works by emerging geniuses of the New York school. His pre-war love of French modernism morphs into a love of post-war American modernism. This is how we got our Hans Hofmann here, our Rothko, our Pollock, our Klein, our Rosenquist, and our Lichtenstein. And I have to tell you that in photographs taken of him at the time, in the 1950s and 60s in Provincetown in New York, he's never looked happier. Here he is in Provincetown with the artist Karl Knass, and here he is with the painter Robin Reichenberg and his wife Chick, and of course with Andy Warhol in New York. He's having a ball. This is also where he finally makes the decision to throw off the sham of his patrician New York life. It never really worked for him anyway. He and Jean give up all of their past luxuries, their yacht, her jewelry, his horses, and their lavish entertaining. They trade their chauffeured limousine in New York for the bus and subway. And he sells off North Wales, he sells off his stake in the Chrysler Building, and gives up any lingering association with the family business to free up every dime and all his energy for his museum. This is when Walter at last emerges as a personal maverick, his own man, his art totally his life. He's casual, he's relaxed. Oh, and by the way, here he is. There he is, right, there he is right there. See him? He's just on the shore with other artists, blah, blah, blah. Relaxed. He eats breakfast at the local fisherman's restaurant and then checks in at the museum, where he perches on a plastic chair at the front door, wearing a sport shirt and casual slacks. He takes visitors on tours, and he even rearranges the postcards in the rack in the museum's lobby. He hated it when they got messed up. Doesn't that sound familiar? Yet there were persistent problems. Walter continually pressured Provincetown to up its support for the museum and its operating budget. Everything from the light bill to a new parking lot. Even today, Provincetown has only about 4,000 year-round residents, and it couldn't begin to afford his demands. Now, the standoff leads to years of frustration and finally to Walter's search for another larger American museum with real community support. Spoiler alert, that would be us. Much more critically, in 1962, he organized a traveling exhibition from his collection, something that he regularly did during the 1940s and 1950s and 60s, yet this one ignited a firestorm of condemnation. The show, entitled The Controversial Century, and there's the catalog there, included over 200 of his European and American paintings produced between 1850 and 1950. Among them, and that is Matisse's Dance, and he did own that at one time, among them were scores of bona fide blue-chip masterworks. But there were also a sizable number of questionable works that were soon denounced as out-and-out fakes by the newly formed Art Dealers Association of America and the New York critics, and they were out to get him. Walter was a tough customer, and they had all been burned by him in the past, and they wanted to make a point of him. And they were fakes. Walter bought most of them from two dodgy New York art dealers, Hartert Gallery and Harry Yatnakparian. They were widely known to be disreputable, and they were even rumored to produce forgeries. What was Walter thinking? Was it all an innocent mistake? Was he collecting so furiously that he couldn't properly vet everything he was buying? Or did he know full well what he was doing, hoping that he could legitimize those fakes by hanging them alongside his masterpieces? We don't know. He never fessed up to anything. There is a tendency in Walter's life to play fast and loose, to tempt fate right up to the edge of self-destruction. You remember his crash and burn in Key West 17 years earlier. And I've only got 4 more pages, so we're almost over. Except this time there was no one to muffle the scandal. Walter's shame was trumpeted in Look magazine, Life magazine, and the New York Times. The fakes were quietly removed from the collection, leaving a vast treasure house of unquestionably authentic works. But his reputation and the view of his collection never fully recovered from the scandal. He becomes even more secretive. Okay, nevertheless, despite the scandal, wait a minute, do I have this? There we go. Nevertheless, despite the scandal, when 8 years later he at last had his fill of Provincetown, city fathers, and went shopping for a better home for his collection, there was no shortage of bidders. Dozens of American museums all across the country came calling. Fortunately for us, we had a double agent working on Norfolk's behalf, Jean Chrysler, who longed to bring their decades of hard work back to her hometown. She phones Norfolk's mayor at the time, Roy Martin, who tells him to move on it. And he got the ball rolling. And after months of deal making and even some local resistance, a lot of people didn't want Walter, they didn't want to rename the museum the Chrysler Museum, Walter agrees to bring his collection to Norfolk. Now, both sides of Walter's maverick tendencies would play out here over the next 17 years as the museum came to grips with his astonishing donation and became increasingly professional to deal with it. And Walter continued to work tirelessly to grow the collection. In the 1970s, for example, he convinced his sister, his only surviving sibling, Bernice Chrysler Garbish, and her husband, and you see them up there at the upper left, to donate more than 70 paintings from their nationally renowned collection of 19th century American folk art. And in 1986, he helped broker a deal to bring James Rico's phenomenal collection of 19th century American marble sculpture to the Chrysler, at a time when that material was still undervalued. Walter the Maverick strikes again. He supported the museum's burgeoning photography department, and he and Jean, especially Jean, went on to build one of the finest art reference libraries in the Southeast, on and on and on. And after a fairly wild and woolly decade with him at the helm, Walter began to move away from his micromanagement of the place. He passed the torch to a new generation of professionally trained directors and curators who went on to research and refine and expand the collection and sensitively reinstall it, and who, along with extraordinary city and community support, oversaw 3 triumphal building renovations and expansions, the last one including a glass studio. Walter died in 1988. He was 79 years old, and already by the early 1990s, even his most vociferous New York critics were gushing at his life's accomplishment. In 1991, the New York Times called Walter, quote, the most underrated American art collector of the past 50 years and more. His way of collecting art, quote, completely in line with today's taste. He went his own way at his own pace. A strong and uncompromising nature permeates every room of the museum, and that nature carries us along by the sheer force of his commitment. Sounds like a maverick to me. Another eminent critic praised Walter's single-minded vision and his fervor to persuade others to follow. Again, a maverick. Even Walter's archenemy in life, the New York critic Hilton Kramer, had to eat crow. Chrysler managed, he says, to convert a sometimes uncontrollable obsession into an aesthetic enterprise of public importance. An expanded and resplendent Chrysler Museum now stands as an admirable monument to his character. Apparently in death, all is forgiven. There was one final and unpleasant hiccup when Walter, at his death, just missed updating his will. And all the works that were still on loan to us and that would have come to us, would have been ours, had he signed in time on the dotted line, went instead to his brother Jack's son, who sold them all at Sotheby's in New York, here's the catalog, in 1989. Now, I know that Walter meant for us to have those things. It was just miserably bad timing. I was crushed at the time, though I've come to think of it more philosophically over the years. I see it now as just the final dust-up with a lifelong maverick. Our years with Walter were like a slow-mo poker game with an unpredictable card shark. There were bad hands and sleights of hand along the way, but in the end, we won the game. Back in 1972, Mr. Chrysler said, I intend to build a museum that damn well could become the final monument to the Chrysler name, outliving the company my father founded. And today, as I walk through the Chrysler's galleries filled with miraculous things, I can't help but think that he may yet be proven right. Thank you.
When you take questions, please repeat the question.
Okay. Oh, wow. Do a little dance. Well, I've gone over time, but I'm told that we have a few minutes for questions. I'm having trouble. Let me see. Maybe we get the lights up. If we get the lights up, I can see people. They raise their hands. So we can do a few if you all have any questions. What am I doing? What are we doing? Oh, yes. Pardon me?
Have you written the book?
No, I have not written the book. I don't think I could live long enough to write the book. It's a tempting proposition because of how unique he was and how important he was in post-war American art collecting. But heavenly days, the man just, he didn't keep a paper trail. I mean, you saw that list, that René Haas invoice from Paris in the 1950s. I am sure Walter bought all of those pictures, and I'd say there were about a dozen there that he kept, and the rest he traded. He was using art to trade. And he didn't say where these things went or when they went or whatever, so it would be tough. Yeah, people are leaning on me, I don't know. Nope, hot dog.
Any other
Oh,
questions?
yes.
How did you find all of the early photos of him?
The Getty images, they have a lot of stuff, and if you look carefully, you can find them. We have a good photo archive of the family. So we have a lot of those early pictures, a lot of the studio photographs of Walter. We have the originals of those, and of the family as well. But some of the more intimate things you can get online now. Yes. Yes.
Who are the family members that were bailing him out along the way?
Family members bailing him out along the way? Well, his mother and father, certainly, to begin with. After a certain point, no one bailed him out. Once he married Jean, well, once his parents died, he had enough money to go his own way. And no, he didn't. No, he invested very quickly in art and used that as capital. So he was pretty good. Yes. Somebody raise their hand? No? No? Yeah. Yes, I'm sorry.
How is his relationship with his siblings?
Relationship with his siblings. Boy, that's tough. I think he got along with them. He was particularly fond of his nephew, Jack, one of the two children that his brother Jack had. I think he probably made his presence known. It's interesting that the two children closest to the mother, Della, Walter and Thelma, were a bit imperious and off-putting. The two that were closest to the father, the auto exec, and that was Jack and, the folk art person. Yeah, they were much more friendly and open. I don't know how those two contingents worked together, but I think they got along at Christmas.
Do you have a favorite piece in his collection?
Oh, golly, many. No, I mean, there are a lot I'd like to take home.
Did he have a favorite?
Oh, did he have a favorite? Whew. I have no idea. He was always very closed mouthed about passions. He would say general things. This is a strong picture. Or he had a statement where he'd say, well, you know, even a genius can't paint a masterpiece every day. He would say that. Someone would say, that's a really good painting. I don't know. You know, so his views were kind of generalized. For all that he collected, it's hard to know what his eye was all about. Didn't leave much behind. I'll take a few more. How about waving in the back?
Miles Chapel.
Oh, hey, how are you?
Thank you for a very nice paper.
Sure.
Putting humanity back into our donor.
Yeah.
I want to say two things. One is Walter was terribly helpful to us at William and Mary as
Good.
we founded the Muscarelli in the 1970s. It opened in the 1980s. And the second is a question. Did he leave you with a vision of what he hoped for in the museum in the future?
No, he was very liberal and open-minded about that. He left a little money. He allowed us to deaccession what he had given us. He put very few restrictions on his collection and any future. He believed that the museum was an organic entity and would grow beyond him. Okay, two more. Yes.
Has anybody interviewed David Stedman on his relationship?
That's a lot of that is in Peggy Earle's book. So, and David, you know, is no longer with us. Yes, but he was interviewed back in 2005 by Peggy. So there are a number of pages of comments in there. All the curators got their comments in. Okay, one more.
Did you question Miss Picasso, the designer? Because I know he would go to their house in Paris and buy them milk and stuff. Because Picasso was always broke.
I haven't heard that one. I know that when he and Peggy went to Paris, I haven't heard that story about Walter Chrysler paying or bringing Pablo Picasso groceries because he was broke. I do know that when he was in New York, buying New York school things, he would pay in cash struggling artists, and they loved him. One artist sold a major work to him and said, now I can buy a mattress. And then when he was in Paris with Peggy, he told Peggy when they were about to go out to dress poor so that they looked poor and they could bargain.